Hello and welcome, one and all. Delighted to welcome you to my living room one more time for a Zoom interactive adventures and ideas. Actually, this is a dialogue seminar from Carolina Public Humanities. My name is Max Orr. I'm the executive director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it's my absolute delight to welcome you to this incredible seminar on art, monuments, and power, Native American cultures before 1500. We are, to let you know who we are, if you're new to Carolina Public Humanities, we are the College of Arts and Sciences Outreach Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's our duty and mission to bring scholarship and great faculty from UNC at Chapel Hill out into the community. And we do that, of course, through these weekend seminars. But I want to mention to you, we also have an extensive K through 12 program. We'll be putting some information on all of this into our chat down here. You can see that. And of course, an extensive state outreach with community colleges and other institutions throughout North Carolina. For the past year, we've been doing this, as you know, as you can imagine, completely through these virtual technologies. It's been an incredible opportunity for us to reach all sorts of people, but of course it's somewhat limiting. I will say we are happy to say at Carolina Public Humanities that we have started live programming again. We had our first shot at it on Thursday night with a program on Chopin, and we had a hybrid audience. That means some people were there in the room and others were watching at home. And it felt great, and we hope to be doing more of that. And I will mention a few programs coming up that'll give you that opportunity. I also want to just thank so many people before we get going who help us do all of this. First of all, Paul Bonici behind the scenes here from Carolina Public Humanities has been absolutely essential in making sure that you can see all of this throughout this last year. So thank you, Paul, for all the work you've been doing to make sure that we are able to have this virtual access. Vicki Breeden back at the mothership, monitoring this and also making sure that all of you get all the materials that you need, the agenda for today. We have, of course, joining us from New Mexico, I saw, is our director, Lloyd Kramer. So welcome, Lloyd. And of course, Susan Landstrom is here, and all the folks at Carolina Public Humanities have been just so outstanding to work with through this incredible thing we've dealt with for the past year, and of course in normal times as well. We also want to thank our sponsors, the Cotton Merck Group and Morgan Stanley. Have been underwriting or helping to support our K through 12 programs for a number of years now. We're grateful for their support. Carolina Meadows, which is a retirement community in Chapel Hill, supports both our K-12 facing programs as well as our public facing programs. We'd like to thank the North Caroliniana Society, a partner of ours, a sponsoring partner of ours, with whom we put on these incredible teacher workshops. I'll talk a little bit about our teacher workshops in the break between our two speakers today, but the incredible support for years now, putting on extensive teacher workshops with the North Caroliniana Society. So thank you for their support. And of course, we want to thank the General Alumni Association, with whom we put on so many programs, and they help us publicize programs and support many of our initiatives, including these Adventures and Ideas seminars. So thank you for our sponsoring partners. We're having a little bit of a later start today, so I'm going to keep these introductions a little bit short. I will go over some of our upcoming programs in our break, so please stay tuned to that. Of course, you can always go to humanities.unc.edu if you'd like to get any more of that information on upcoming programs, and of course information on how you can support Carolina Public Humanities as well. Well, let's get right to it. We want to introduce our first speaker today, and I'll have him turn on the camera. And hopefully you can be seen. This is much more important than you can be seen than I can be seen. I promise you that. First, I want to welcome Vincas Stepanidis. He is the William Leuchtenberg Distinguished Professor of Archaeology and Anthropology. Of course, we know as Bill Leuchtenberg. We just had him do a wonderful program. It's an honor to have that name attached to your wonderful position. Vincas Stepanidis has been with the UNC since 1988. He is a brilliant archaeologist who studies the American, especially Native American archaeology in areas such as the Mississippi Valley. Right now, he is at the Natchez Historical Site. We are going to, I'm eating so much into your time, Vin. By the way, Vincas does go by Vin or Dr. Stepanidis. I just want to mention a few brief things about the type of work that Dr. Stepanidis does. He works on excavations on Feltus mounds in the lower Mississippi Valley. For years, he's been working on archaeology of Moundville with one of his great monographs on the ceramics of the archaeology of Moundville. Also is interested in the iconography and style of Mississippian art and in French colonial Louisiana as well. We are going to put information on all the great work that Dr. Stepanidis has done for you down here in the chat feature here. Before I begin, I just want to make sure we're technologically able to see Vin. Is everyone, can we see you? Can you see yourself, Vin? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Well,
unfortunately.
Well, welcome. We are delighted to welcome you. I'm sorry for somewhat of a truncated opening there. We had a few technological difficulties, but as I said, we are delighted to have you. And we're so thankful for the work you've done with us in the past and joining us through the ether coming from Natchez. Welcome. We're delighted to have you. Folks, please welcome Vincent Stepanidis.
Right. Thank you so much, Max, for inviting me to do this program, and also for that nice introduction. I'm joining you from the historic Natchez Foundation. I'm about 3 blocks from the Mississippi River here in Natchez, Mississippi, and I'm in the right spot to give this talk because much of it will be about the ancient cultures that lived in this part of the world. But before I start talking about the ancient American South, which is of course one of my favorite topics, let me talk just a little bit about archaeology in general. So when I tell people that I'm an archaeologist, just in conversation, the first thing they assume is that I work in some other part of the world. They immediately ask me, well, do you work in Egypt? Do you work in Rome? Or maybe Mexico? And I say no to all of those. And when I tell them that I do my archaeology in the American South, most people are surprised. They say, you mean we have archaeology here? And that sort of curious amnesia exists in many parts of the United States about the distant past. And it's so different from the way things are in Europe or in Latin America even, where people are very, very aware of the local archaeology. And the reason for that is really simple. When I went to school, the historical narrative that I was taught, that is, when I high school and pre-high school, the narrative that I was taught, if you went back in time, would go back to the first settlement of this continent by the Europeans, and then the grand narrative of history would shift across the ocean, and people would talk about ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, so that most school kids in this country know much more about the archaeology of those parts of the world than they do about the archaeology of where they lived. And this is slowly starting to change, but it really is true that most folks in this country know very, very little about America's ancient past. And we know, and that's not for lack of research. Archaeology has been done in North America and in Mesoamerica for 2 centuries. There's been a tremendous amount of scholarship done, a tremendous amount has been learned. Archaeologists all over the world are interested in the archaeology of the South and read about it, but that archaeology and the story that it tells has not really sort of reached the public consciousness. So, which is one reason why I so appreciate the opportunity to give talks like this. Now, let me also just say a few words about what archaeology is and how it works. Much of the public perception of archaeology is informed by things like the Indiana Jones movies. And if you watch Harrison Ford on the big screen, you might get the impression that the point of archaeology is to find beautiful things. The gold pendant, the ancient temple, the glorious statue. And it is true that archaeologists look for and find things. But that is only a means to an end, because the real point of archaeology is not things, but people. Archaeologists seek to reconstruct how people lived in the past, what their cultures were like, and how those cultures changed through time. So in many ways, what archaeologists do is identical to what academic historians do. We're just trying to reconstruct the chronicle of human history. The difference between archaeologists on one hand and historians on the other is in the evidence that they use. Historians rely on the written word. They rely on documents, newspapers, things that people wrote down. And it's a very rich source of evidence, and it's a very important source of evidence. But if you look at the broad span of human history, just in round numbers, humans have been on this planet for maybe 2 million years. Writing is a very, very late invention. When I do this, when I give a talk like this in a classroom, I'll draw a timeline on the board that might be 20 feet long, and writing appears in the last couple of inches. So to get at the full sweep of human history, we can't rely on the written word alone. And what archaeologists rely on instead is material evidence, the kinds of things that people use in their daily lives and threw away, traces of the buildings that they built, and so on. That material record, the record of material objects, and the traces that people left in the soil where they lived form the kinds of evidence that archaeologists use. And that's the kind of evidence that underlies the kinds of stories and the kinds of narratives that I'm going to be talking about today. So let me move on and get into the heart of this talk. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do two different things in this talk, one leading to the other. In the beginning, what I want to do is to talk about just the broad timeline of archaeology in the South, just to sort of give you a sense of what we know about the sort of when people arrived, when monuments began, when farming began, and so forth. And that will set the stage for focusing in on the period after AD 1000, which is, and where I'm going to talk in more detail about the way people lived in the 5 centuries before the European arrival, focusing especially on their politics, their monumental architecture, and their art. So if you give me a minute, I will share my screen and I will start my slides and we will be off and running. Let me go to the beginning. There we go. All right, can everyone, I trust everyone can see that. So what are some of the highlights of the archaeology of the South and what we know about the South's ancient past? I'm going to sort of cover these 4 topics, the first 3 quickly, and then the 4th I will dwell on at greater length. And the key things to know about the ancient past in the South is that people arrived about 16,000 years ago. The exact date is still being debated by archaeologists. Some people are arguing for an earlier date, but it's now pretty commonly accepted that people have been here for about 16,000 years. Another thing I want to talk about is the earliest monument construction, which begins about 6,000 years ago, and also about early farming, which began in the South about 5,000 years ago. But then I'm going to focus in and talk a lot about what happened starting at about AD 1000. And we'll talk about the politics, the monuments, and the art of that period in more detail. So let's start with the first peopling. You know, one of the grand questions of archaeology in the Americas is, when did people first arrive? And this has been a question that's been debated for a very long time. But in the last century or so, we really have gotten a tremendous amount of evidence that makes it clear that the first people to arrive in the Western Hemisphere, in this part of the world, were people who arrived from Asia by crossing the area that is now the Bering Strait. Linguistic evidence, genetic evidence, cultural evidence, all points to Northeast Asia as the source of the first people to come into North America. And the story of how they got here is a very interesting one. You see those arrows going across the Bering Strait, which is now a body of water. But you have to keep in mind that 16,000 years ago, we were in the last ice age. And nowadays, we read a lot about what happens when the climate warms. We all know that as the climate warms, ice sheets melt and sea level rises. But what we don't read about in the newspaper is that Exactly the opposite happens when climates get colder. During the last ice age, there were enormous continental ice sheets in the northern latitudes of both the western and the eastern hemisphere. In North America, there were these two massive ice sheets that covered almost all of what is nowadays Canada. And these ice sheets were like a mile or 2 miles thick. That is an enormous amount of water locked up in the form of ice on land. And when you have that much ice sitting on land, the water that forms that ice ultimately comes out of the ocean, so that when ice sheets expand, sea levels drop. And when sea levels drop more than 50 meters, which they did during the last ice age, what is now the Bering Strait becomes dry land. And so Siberia, what is now Siberia and what is now Alaska, were one continuous landmass. There was essentially, it was called the Bering Land Bridge or Beringia. And so the first people who came into the Americas essentially walked across from Siberia to Alaska. And as they were going across, they weren't aware, I'm sure, that they were crossing from one continent to another, because it was just one continuous landmass. The Bering Land Bridge, sometimes when you hear people talk about it, people imagine some narrow causeway that you had to balance as you walked across. The Bering Land Bridge was over 1,000 kilometers wide. So it was just one continuous landmass and people just walked across. Walking across, this area was largely unglaciated, and it was really a rich environment. It was cold, but it was full of animals and plants that could be eaten. So for hunters and gatherers, which is what these people were, it was a good place to live. A bigger challenge was how to get from what is now Alaska down into the lower 48, because the path was blocked by these massive ice sheets. There are two possibilities. At one point in time, a corridor opened up between the two major ice sheets, and that was one possible pathway for going south. And the other possible pathway was along the coast. Archaeologists debate which is the more likely route, and they're not mutually exclusive. But the thing that makes it hard to decide is that archaeological evidence in both areas is really hard to find. In this corridor between the ice sheets, it's hard to find because the ice sheets have moved and have obliterated a lot of that evidence. And evidence of a coastal migration is hard to find because what was then the coast, remember sea levels were lower, is now inundated. The beach 16,000 years ago was the edge of the continental shelf, which is now underwater. So it's really hard to find the archaeological sites that would prove it one way or the other. But we do know that there were people living all over the lower 48 by about 15 or 16,000 years ago, and they were living in the triangle. This is a point of a style called Clovis that is well dated to about 13,000 BCE that was found in Durham County. And points like this are found all over North Carolina. So there were definitely people living here 15,000 years ago and probably even a little earlier. What about monuments? The earliest monuments in the South appear in the lower Mississippi Valley, not far from where I'm sitting, after about 4000 BC. And keep in mind that when the people first came over to this continent, they were hunters and gatherers. We know from the archaeological record and from ethnographic studies of hunting and gathering people, that the typical hunting and gathering lifeway was people lived in small kin-based groups. Bands might have been 25, 50, 100 people who moved over the landscape in order to find food. When you're not growing your own food, you have to be, in most places, mobile. You have to move to where the food is at different times of year. And so the people were nomadic. They lived in small groups. They were generally egalitarian in their social and political arrangements. And in that kind of a setting, you don't expect to see large monuments or even permanent settlements because people are essentially living in portable shelters because they're constantly on the move. So that was a situation when people first arrived on this continent. But by about 4000 BC, in some parts of the continent, particularly in the lower Mississippi Valley, you start to see changes. And one of those changes is the appearance of these large earthen mounds, which in later periods were religious and political monuments. And we have every reason to believe that they were religious and political monuments 6,000 years ago when they first appeared. I will note that the earliest mounds here in the lower Mississippi Valley are among the earliest anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. There's some parts of coastal Peru that have monuments that are as early, but none that are earlier than the ones we find here in the South. So this is a LiDAR image, a kind of an aerial map made by bouncing a laser beam off the surface of the Earth of one of the earliest large monumental sites in the South. It's a site called Watson Break that's been radiocarbon dated to about 3400 BCE. It's an artificially constructed oval pattern of mounds near Monroe, Louisiana. And here's another map. The oval is about 300 meters across. The largest mound is about 6 meters high. So this dirt is not being moved with front end loaders and bulldozers. This is being moved entirely by hand. And that is a large amount of earth, a tremendous amount of labor that is being deployed in order to build a site like this. Fast forward a little farther in time to about 1000 BC. And here's another site in Louisiana called Poverty Point. This is about a 2-hour drive from where I'm sitting. It's a World Heritage Site. And what Poverty Point consists of are 6 artificially constructed concentric ridges that you see here. And then this enormous mound called Mound A. And what you can't see in this slide, because the scale is so small, is how big these earthworks are. These concentric ridges, again, entirely built by hand, are 3/4 of a mile in diameter. This is an enormous site. This site is so large. Even though the site was known in the 19th century and everybody knew this was an artificial mound, the ridges weren't discovered, or people didn't realize that they were artificially constructed until the 1940s, when an archaeologist looked at an air photo and saw how symmetrical these ridges were. When you're on the landscape, the scale of those ridges is so large that it just looks like the kind of natural up and down of the landscape. So here it is, from way up in the air. So when you look at a monumental site like this, you have to think of the earth that forms these mounds as fossilized labor. In order to build an earthwork this size, you needed a large labor force, and you needed someone to get everybody moving in the same direction and to motivate them to build something this large and elaborate. So clearly, these are not sort of typical hunters and gatherers in small bands with a very sort of egalitarian society. There clearly had to be a leadership and some form of social complexity that allowed someone to sort of mobilize this much labor. And also there had to be a fairly high population density nearby so that the labor would even be there to be mobilized. And one reason this probably happens in the lower Mississippi Valley is that this is an extremely rich environment for hunters and gatherers, and probably had higher population densities than just about anywhere else in North America. Mound A, that big mound at the top of those arcs of ridges, this is a photograph of it I took a few years back. It is so large that I had to take it as a panorama. The earthwork is about 700 feet long. This part is 35 feet high. This part is 70 feet high. If any of you are familiar with the UNC Chapel Hill campus, the amount of earth in this mound alone, not even to mention the ridges and the other mounds at the site, if you filled up Polk Place, that space between South Building and Wilson Library, if you filled that with dirt from ground level up to the tops of the buildings, that is the amount of dirt that it took to build this earthwork. Imagine piling up that much dirt entirely by hand, by digging it, carrying it in baskets, and dumping it to make a mound. And so that gives you a sense of the amount of labor invested in these constructions. It is fascinating that Poverty Point, Watson Break, these are being built by hunters and gatherers. These people are not farming. So they're living off the land, but probably because of the richness of the local environment, even though they were able to mobilize large groups of people and to engage in these sorts of public works. This is an artist's conception of Poverty Point during its time of occupation. We know that people lived on these ridges. You can see the refuse of daily life that's dumped into the swales between the ridges. And you can see sort of fireplaces and other evidence of occupation on top of these ridges. The big archaeological debate is about whether this occupation on the ridges was a year-round permanent occupation, or whether this was a place of pilgrimage and gathering, a place where different hunting and gathering groups would come together for ceremonies and to trade. That debate is still going on. I think most archaeologists favor the latter interpretation. This was a place of gathering rather than permanent habitation. But as new evidence comes in, that story might change. So we've got early monuments about 6,000 years ago, which get to be really big monuments by about 3,000 years ago. And the other early piece of the puzzle has to do with farming. Farming begins in Eastern North America by about 3000 BC, or about 5,000 years ago. And the area where the earliest evidence of farming occurs is shown in this map. It's what we call the Mid-South, kind of the lower Midwest and the upper South. It was in this area that the first evidence of cultivated plants and of domesticated plants appears in the archaeological record. And note that Poverty Point and Watson Break, they're down here. People are farming to the north when Poverty Point was built, but there's no evidence of that farming down here yet, where the large monument construction is taking place. So farming and monumentality sort of develop in parallel and eventually converge, but at this early date are being done in two different places. So how can we tell archaeologically when people start farming? And the key evidence is in the plants themselves. When people start to cultivate crops and genetic changes start happening in the plants that are visible archaeologically. A good example is maize. You know, everybody knows what a corn cob looks like. The wild ancestor of maize is a wild grass whose seeds look nothing like corn kernels. And it's thousands of years of human intervention that caused genetic changes in the plant and resulted in what we eat on the dinner table when we have corn on the cob in front of us. And the key, there are many indicators in the plant of domestication, but the principal ones are changes in the size and shape of seeds. They often get much bigger once domestication happens. And also many plants lose their natural seed dispersal mechanism. And corn is a perfect example of that. The wild ancestor of corn, when the seeds were ripe, it would be like a dandelion head. You just touch it and the seeds would disperse. But when you harvest the plant, you don't want the seeds to fall off. So farming selects for the disappearance of natural seed dispersal mechanisms. So corn kernels are stuck to the cob so tight that they can't disperse naturally. Corn depends on human beings to be propagated. It would die out if left on its own in the wild. So when you look at a worldwide perspective on the beginnings of farming, farming is now practiced everywhere in the world, except in the very high latitudes. And in most parts of the world, when farming first starts in the archaeological record, you can tell that it was borrowed from a neighbor. But if you go farther back in time, you find only certain places where farming was not a borrowed practice, but started all by itself. It started kind of independently. And there are only 9 places in the world shown on this map where archaeologically we can tell that farming was independently invented, not borrowed from some neighboring region. And Eastern North America, the Mid-South, is one of these 9 places in the world where that happened. Now, what were they farming back then? When you think of native farming in North America, the first plant that comes to mind is maize. But in this early agricultural complex, people call it the Eastern Agricultural Complex, maize was nowhere in sight. The plants that were cultivated are ones that, many of them are ones that most people have never heard of. Goosefoot, marsh elder, squash, which you have heard of, although it wasn't a fleshy squash, it was a kind of a thick rinded squash, sunflower, maygrass, knotweed, and little barley. These are all kind of weedy plants, many of which you can find today growing as weeds in their wild form rather than in their domesticated form. One of the principal plants, goosefoot, I was excavating a site years ago where a stand of wild goosefoot grew up, and I took this picture of an immature goosefoot plant. A goosefoot plant produces thousands and thousands of really tiny little starchy seeds. When it's cultivated, the seeds change in shape. They get this truncated margin. This is a microscopic image of a cultivated goosefoot seed. And if you've had quinoa, a goosefoot is a close relative of the quinoa that you buy in the grocery store. That the quinoa is still cultivated in Latin America. Its close cousin, goosefoot, was cultivated in ancient times by the native people of North America. Sumpweed, this is sunflower, which you're familiar with. Sumpweed is a close relative of sunflower. This is wild sumpweed that grows today. The cultivated form has much larger seeds than the wild form, and the cultivated form simply doesn't exist today. You see it only archaeologically. So we've got, thousands of years ago, farming and monument construction begin in the South, but in separate places. Let's now fast forward to the period I want to talk about in more detail. And this is the period after AD 1000 or CE 1000, the last sort of 500 years before Europeans arrive. And this is a time when throughout the South, you find a kind of a very different way of life, and it's the way of life that was encountered when the Europeans first arrived. AD 1000 was a time of tremendous change all across North America, and particularly in the South. And one of the things you see happening after 1000 AD is, first of all, people are living now in fairly large towns. Sometimes these towns were nucleated, sort of, with the houses concentrated. Sometimes they were more dispersed. But people are living in permanent settlements on the landscape, and their economy, their sustenance is largely based on the farming of maize. Maize, the history of maize in North America is really interesting. It first appears in the South at about the start of the Christian era, but it appears in just trace amounts. It's there, people know about it, but it is not a significant part of the diet. It's barely detectable as a part of the diet. But in the 2 centuries, from about AD 800 to AD 1000, corn goes from almost nothing in the diet to being the mainstay of the diet. In those short 200 years, maize becomes the staple food. And maize is an incredibly productive source of food when it is intensively cultivated, as it was by 1000 AD. And it really sort of transformed the way of life and made possible large concentrations of people, and made possible generating surplus which could underwrite all sorts of interesting political developments. So this is an example of Indian corn from upstate New York from the 19th century. But archaeologically, we find maize when it's carbonized. Plant remains preserved in the South only if they've been sort of charred and turned to charcoal. And so it's very common to find maize cobs and maize kernels in archaeological sites after AD 1000. In fact, they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere because so much of it was grown and eaten and used in a variety of ways. And together with the appearance of intensive maize agriculture comes a transformation in politics and society. We talked about the presence of mounds 3,000 to 6,000 years ago as indicating that there had to be some form of leadership to coordinate and mobilize the labor that built those mounds. But those leaders are kind of invisible in the archaeological record. We don't find the residences of chiefs. We don't find, there are no sort of elaborate graves of chiefs. The leadership, whoever the leaders were, did not sort of differentiate themselves from others in the society in any way that we can see archaeologically. But by AD 1000, that has changed. And so what you have are the appearance of large civic ceremonial centers. You have people living in towns across the landscape, and scattered among those towns are large civic ceremonial centers that are often marked by earthworks. Unlike these sort of dome-shaped earthworks from earlier periods, these, the mounds that appear at this time are kind of flat-topped pyramids, often arranged around plazas. There are hundreds of sites all across the South with relatively small mounds, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites, probably thousands. But there are also certain sites that really rose to prominence and were clearly major centers that were politically and economically influential over large regions. One of these sites is the Etowah site in North Georgia, about an hour's drive northwest of Atlanta. It's a state park. If you're ever there, it's worth a visit. This is kind of an architect's view of it. It kind of shows the mounds. It shows the defensive wooden stockade around the site and the moat that originally surrounded it. But you have to imagine these sites as being populated. There are buildings, there's people, there's what you don't see in this picture. This is a photograph of the big mound at Etowah. Again, a massive construction. It's probably more than 70 feet high. These are large oak trees. You can sort of get a sense of scale by looking at those. And again, you have to imagine these civic ceremonial centers as having buildings on them. And these flat top mounds essentially were platforms for buildings. And the buildings that sat on top of these mounds were public buildings. They were either the residences of chiefs, or they were other sorts of public buildings like temples or council houses. So this is an artist's conception of the town of Coosa, which was also in North Georgia, not far from Etowah, in the 1540s when the Spaniard De Soto first went through this area. And I'm using this slide because you can see, and this is 3 small pyramidal mounds around a plaza, and each of these mounds has a building on it, a wooden building, with a thatched roof and mud plastered walls. And then in the background is the big mound at Coosa, which would have been the residence of the paramount chief. And we know from De Soto's accounts that the paramount chief at Coosa received tribute from towns hundreds of miles away. He had sway over a very, very large area. Another really important mound site was the site of Cahokia, which is just across the river from downtown St. Louis. It was located in the Mississippi Valley. This is the earliest of the large Mississippian towns. And in fact, Cahokia, it's hard to call it a town. It really was more of a city. It has over 100 mounds. It covers many square miles. And this is an architectural view of what archaeologists call downtown Cahokia, the heart of the site. And in the heart of downtown Cahokia was this large earthwork called Monk's Mound. It has the interstate highway running behind it. Now, if you drive into St. Louis on the interstate that comes from the east, I can't remember what the number of that highway is, you drive right past this mound. This mound is 1,000 feet long. It's 100 feet high. It is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, and it was built very, very quickly, right around AD 1050, when Cahokia had its so-called Big Bang. And this is one of more than 100 mounds that are scattered through this area. And again, Cahokia, you have to imagine Cahokia as an inhabited place. This is a view of downtown Cahokia, and with sort of showing houses, again, an artist's conception. But the key thing about Cahokia, when I was a student coming up and learning archaeology for the first time, a few people suggested that Cahokia might have had a population of 10,000 people. And that seemed awfully high. That seemed wild at the time. But a lot more archaeology has been done in Cahokia and in the surrounding area since then. And 10,000 is the bare minimum. I think more recent estimates, and I think they're realistic, is that at its height in maybe the 11th and 12th century AD, Cahokia and its immediate surroundings had 30 to 40,000 people living there. That is bigger than London was at the same time. So this was an enormous constellation of people, people who lived, who built monuments, who engaged in ceremonies. And at Cahokia, you can see evidence of social differentiation. The chiefs, who were invisible back when Poverty Point and Watson Break were built, in this period become very visible, because not only do we see elite residences that are built on top of mounds, that are placed on top of mounds as a way of separating them from the commoners, but also you see strong evidence of social differentiation in funerary rituals and mortuary patterns. This is a map of a mound at Cahokia that was excavated I believe in the 60s. And essentially, this mound contains the sealed remains of a number of very elaborate funerary rituals, and in each of which you have one or more central figures who are buried with very elaborate elite regalia. And accompanying them are many people who appear to be sacrificed. There are pits with, say, 30 young women who are all buried at the same time, along with the central figures that are buried in elite regalia. So it very much looks like the kinds of ceremonies that would be attached to the funeral of a paramount chief or a king. And again, so this is a diorama that appears in the museum at Cahokia. It's a state park, another World Heritage Site. If you're ever in St. Louis, you should visit it. You can. I once stayed in a hotel in downtown St. Louis whose windows faced the Mississippi River. I could see Cahokia, the Great Mound at Cahokia, from my window. It's that close. And there's a building that's been uncovered archaeologically on the highest point of Monk's Mound, that enormous mound, that almost certainly would have been the residence of the paramount chief who brought all these people together and who mobilized the labor that built this magnificent site. And another site I want to talk about, and the one I'll talk about in more detail, is Moundville. This is a site in Alabama, near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which I've done my research. This is another one of the great Mississippian towns that comes, it starts up just as Cahokia is declining. Moundville reaches its peak. And it is not as big as Cahokia, but it is still massive in terms of the mound construction. It has more than 20 mounds arranged around a large rectangular plaza surrounded by a fortification wall. This is a better picture of it that sort of shows it being inhabited, shows buildings and on tops of the mounds and around the plaza. This too was the center of another one of the great pre-Columbian chiefdoms of this period. and I'll show you a few pictures. This is, it now is a state park. Also worth a visit if you're ever near Tuscaloosa. This is the big mound, Mound A at the north end of the plaza, 250 feet square at the base, 70 feet high. You get a sense of scale by looking at these. These are people walking up the ramp. This is a modern reconstruction of a building that would have sat on the summit. Here I'm standing on top of that mound looking south across the plaza. That was Mound B. This is Mound A in the center, and about 500 meters away, the four large mounds that form the southern flank. You could put a football field on top of this mound. I mean, and it's about 35 feet high. So again, the scale of construction is huge. And on the tops of these mounds were buildings. This is the archaeological footprint of a building on top of Mound E, which based on the kind of refuse associated with it appears to be an elite residence. And this is a kind of an artist's reconstruction of what that building might have looked like. And the other thing about Moundville is just like at Cahokia, you can see the social differentiation and the differences in social standing in the funerary practices. In the early 20th century, before World War II, there were massive excavations at Moundville, and many burials were discovered. In the 1960s, one of my former professors, Chris Peebles, did a kind of a statistical analysis of these burials. I won't go into the details, but it's just really clear that there's an element of that mortuary population that represents the social and political elite. People who are buried in and near mounds with elaborate regalia, such as this copper headdress. There's a bison bone pin that fit into a socket here, and so it would be used as a headdress. Copper axes that these are not utilitarian axes, these are symbolic axes that may have been a symbol of a particular political office. Copper-covered wooden ear spools. These are ear spools kind of like the size and shape of yo-yos that were worn in the ears as part of elite regalia, and we can see this in the art of that period as well. And then hundreds and hundreds of conch shell beads that are drilled and cut by hand. Conch is a very hard substance. These are made without metal tools. Making these beads is incredibly labor intensive. And again, sort of masses of these beads were part of this elite regalia. So here's a National Geographic reconstruction of an aristocrat at Moundville down in the plaza with the paramount chief in the background. There's clear-cut social differentiation that you see both in the architecture, chief's houses on tops of mounds, and in the funerary practices. And being in Natchez, I just have to mention that these practices, this kind of social differentiation and stratification and political centralization persisted into the early 18th century. Where I am now was the location of the Nachi Nation, the Natchez Nation, people sometimes pronounce it that way, with whom the French interacted in the early 1700s. The French accounts of that period make it clear that the Nachi people had a hereditary aristocracy with three distinct classes, the highest being the sons, the next class of aristocrats being the nobles, and then most of the people being commoners. And they had political offices. The paramount chief was called the Great Son. He was recruited from the aristocratic class. And this is a French depiction, contemporary French depiction of the Great Son being carried by 8 warriors on a litter, wearing his feathered diadem, which was kind of like almost like a plains war bonnet, but attenuated a bit. That was the symbol that only the chief wore. That was essentially like a crown, a symbol of office. And not only were the chiefs and the high political officials treated in special ways when they were alive, they were also treated in special ways when they died. This is a drawing of a funeral of a tattooed serpent, the second ranking chief, the younger brother of the Great Son, who died in 1727. He was buried in the National Temple, which is sitting on top of a mound. and his funeral involved human sacrifice. Again, something that you see much earlier as far back as Cahokia. So this kind of social differentiation and political centralization were characteristic of this period. So now let me transition and talk a little bit about the art. You know, the kinds of representational art that were made during the Mississippian period has been studied for a long time by archaeologists and art historians. But over the last 20 years, there have been some real sort of important breakthroughs in our understanding of that art. And to summarize, we now know that it wasn't, in the 1940s, people believed that it was all one sort of pan-Southern style. It was all the same stuff. But we now know that there are actually many different regional styles, that in each region, there were craftspeople and artisans who worked in a particular style, but things made in one region would move to other regions. So at any given site, you'll have a mixture of things that are locally produced and things that have been brought in from far away, which gave the illusion that the style was sort of uniform all the way across. We now know it wasn't. And the other key insight that has emerged in recent years is that the meaning of the imagery is starting to be understood. And I will just say that for many years, you know, people looked at this imagery and sort of speculated about what it might mean. But starting in the 1990s, an art historian named Kent Riley started bringing together different kinds of scholars into the same room to work on the problem. And so he brought the archaeologists who knew what the imagery looked like and put them in the same room with art historians who knew how to analyze that imagery, put them in the same room with people from native communities who had knowledge of traditions in those communities, and also put them in the same room with the folklorists who knew the sort of all the stories that had been recorded among Native people in the East over many generations, who knew that scholarly literature. And what started to become clear is that the imagery that we were looking at archaeologically had clear reference in the stories that had been recorded by folklorists and that some of which lived on in Native communities today. And when you can link that imagery to specific stories, you really start to understand what it means. And so it's that kind of evidence that underlies what I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. So let me just sort of show you what some of this imagery looks like. This is all sort of from about 1000 AD to about 1500 is the period of time in which these objects are being produced. So you have human figures of various kinds, but this is about more than a foot high, carved from a soft stone. It shows a male figure decked out in regalia with beads and a headdress, a braid coming down, but otherwise not wearing clothing. These are not sort of, these are supernaturals. I'll just tell you that right off the bat. Here's a feline representation of a supernatural who lives on in stories in Native communities even to this day, called the underwater panther or the great serpent. He sometimes appears as a cat, some with a long serpent-like tail, other times as a serpent. Again, he was associated with a part of the cosmos called the beneath world. Here's another version of the great serpent. It's the same supernatural, just in snake form. In this case, it's shown as a rattlesnake with a falcon's eye markings and wings. This supernatural, which looks superficially like a duck, but no duck has a neck that long with serpent-like markings on it. This is a lot of these creatures are composites of birds, snakes, felines, and sometimes humans. And speaking of humans, here's another one of these composite figures. Somebody clearly has a human body with arms and legs. See, there's the knee, like down on all fours, but this is clearly not human. because this being has talons instead of hands, has a falcon's eye marking, has feline facial markings, and these roundels are associated with serpents. So serpent, cat, bird, human, composite, clearly a supernatural. And another supernatural that appears in much of this imagery in many different styles is this hero. This is a kind of a warrior hero. In some of the stories, he appears as a personage called Redhorn or Morning Star. But in the archaeological imagery, he often has this is made of copper, and here's a drawing on the right of what this copper plate shows. He's holding a war club in one hand, a severed head in the other, and his regalia includes these wings. So sort of a very distinctive personage. And here's Birdman carved on a large shell cup from which medicine was drunk. So these are examples of Mississippian imagery and art in many different media, in shell, in copper, in stone, in pottery. And to make a long story short, I think it's fair to say that, based on what we've learned, what the imagery means, there's sort of two categories of imagery. Some of the imagery consists of things that we call cosmograms. They are shorthand depictions of the cosmos as it was understood by the native people of the time. And another whole category of imagery, I'll call them freeze frames. They're freeze frames from stories about supernaturals, about heroes that many people in the community knew. And so this imagery depicts a kind of a scene from a story that then would bring to mind the story that everyone knew. So it kind of like, so a cosmogram is a sort of a shorthand depiction of the universe, and a freeze frame is, I think of it, I was in a Catholic church. You have the Stations of the Cross that tell the story of the crucifixion. Each one of those stations is like a freeze frame from that story, and that's what these images are like. So let's talk about the cosmograms first. If you listen to or read the stories told by native people all across the eastern woodlands and the Great Plains, you hear an image of the cosmos that has certain common elements. And in fact, this is common all across the Western Hemisphere through all the Americas. That the cosmos is layered. There's a middle layer that human beings live on. There's a celestial layer, at least one celestial layer that is the above world, and at least one layer beneath us called the beneath world. And these three layers are connected by a central axis called the axis mundi. And so the central axis up and down is important. And then at the central axis, the four quarters are important: north, east, south, and west. And each of the four quarters, each of the layers of the universe, of the cosmos, were inhabited by certain supernaturals who had powers, important powers, and with whom people would interact. And people and souls could move between levels, either through portals or along this central axis. So this is a sort of a schematic depiction. Here's Earth Island, or the middle world, with beings at each of the four quarters. The above world, populated by certain supernatural beings. The beneath world, populated by others. And then the central axis, which sometimes appears in the art as a pole, sometimes as a tree, the axis mundi that connects all the layers. So with this vision of the cosmos in mind, you look at these two engraved shell pendants that were found in Tennessee. And they look very different. But both of these are cosmograms. They're both shorthand descriptions of the cosmos that I just described, just viewing it from different angles. This is the cosmos, looking at it from above straight down. So what you see is this looped square, which represents the edges of Earth Island the middle world, the birds that inhabit, the weather powers that sort of inhabit the four cardinal directions. And here is that center, but now you're looking straight down the axis of that center pole. So you're looking at the cosmos from above in this depiction. This is exactly the same cosmos. You're just looking at it from the side. Here is the central pole, the central axis. Now you can see it as an axis looking at it from the side. The birds appear on either side, which here, appear in the four quarters. And then this is a schematic description of the beneath world. And let me just show you the details. I'm going through this quickly. There's an elaborate, George Langford, a folklorist, a colleague, has made a very compelling case for what I'm describing. So I'm just telling you his conclusions and not the details of how he arrived at them, but it's by linking these images to stories that he was able to make a convincing case. So here's that pendant on the left, sort of broken out into a three-dimensional model. Here's that central axis, the edge of Earth Island, and then the birds or weather powers at the four quarters. And again, I told you that this was the depiction of the beneath world. What makes that plausible is that in many of the stories, the beneath world is a watery world, and that water is said to be in a large pot that contains the water in the beneath world. This is in the stories. And here, what you see is the neck of a typical Mississippian pot. Here you see the whole pot beneath the feet of the birds. So the certain details in these depictions link it convincingly to the stories that make us understand this as a cosmogram. And then you have the freeze frames. And so let me close by talking a little bit about how these sort of stories appear in the archaeological record. And I'll do it by talking specifically about one of the great towns and centers that I mentioned earlier, that of Moundville. So let's go back to Moundville. The important thing to know is that when you look at the history of Moundville, it has a large population. It is a sort of a densely settled town from about AD 1100 to AD 1250. But in the latter part of the 13th century, the whole character of the settlement changes. Most of the sort of residential population moves out into the outlying hinterlands. And what is left at Moundville is a much smaller population, we believe, of chiefs and priests. And it becomes a sort of a ceremonial center more than a residential center. And in this later period, what happens is that virtually anyone who dies anywhere in the region is brought to Moundville for burial. Most of the graves that were found in the early 20th century at Moundville date to this later period, and the number of graves that are found is way out of proportion to the number of people who are actually living at this place. So it's clear that people are being brought in from far and wide to be buried there. And this is a conclusion that we reached just looking at pottery, chronology, architecture. This is work that I did, and I reached this conclusion not knowing anything about the iconography at the time. This was just purely based on architecture and material culture found at the site. While I was working on this, a folklorist named George Langford was looking at the imagery that was associated with Moundville during that period. And this was unbeknownst to me. And so let me talk about some of that imagery. There's certain motifs, if you look at the locally produced material, certain motifs that occur again and again and again and again in all media. One of these motifs is the so-called hand and eye. It's a human hand with something that looks like an eye in the palm. And so it occurs, here it is on pottery, here it is on stone, here it is on copper, here it is on a stone disc. So you get the hand and eye. You get raptors, hawks. Here are pots, one with the head of a hawk, the other one with the hawk and the hand and eye motif. Now, I was familiar with all these motifs, but I had no idea what they meant. The serpent and the great serpent play a prominent role in the imagery. So here's that engraved rattlesnake. There's the rattle with the wing and the antlers of a deer engraved on a pot. Here's another engraving of the same being. The underwater panther, a different morph of the same supernatural being. And here are two snakes intertwined with the hand and eye in the center. This is the state artifact of Alabama, by the way. So George Langford is looking at this imagery, and he starts reading stories. And he, of course, had an encyclopedic knowledge of the stories that have been recorded among the native people of the South and of the Great Plains. And he suddenly had the insight that all of these images have to do with a particular story. And it is a story of the path of souls, of what happens to the human soul after death. The hand and eye, and so what happens is when someone dies, the soul moves to the edge of Earth Island and through a portal jumps into the celestial world, into the above world. And in some of these stories, that portal was located in a constellation called the Hand, which corresponds to what we see in the sky today as Orion. And right under what we call the belt of Orion is a kind of a fuzzy nebula that you can see on a clear night. And that constellation was seen as the place, the portal into the above world, and it was across the above world that the souls had a journey along the path of souls, which was seen as the Milky Way. So this hand and eye is a allusion, George argues, to a constellation that was at the beginning of the path of souls. And there are many different versions of the story of what happens to the soul as it traverses this path. But at the other end of the Milky Way is another constellation, one that we call Scorpio or Scorpius, but that the native people saw as a serpent. And so this image is the other end of the path of souls. And as the soul traveled along the path, various things would happen, and the soul would have various encounters. There's a place in one of the stories where the Milky Way forks, and at this place in this story, the soul encounters a celestial raptor or hawk. And it's likely that this hawk is an allusion to that part of the story. So essentially what George figured out is that at the same time that Moundville becomes a place where people are brought to be buried, all of the imagery there deals with the path of souls. And Moundville was in effect the portal to the path of souls. So can you imagine the power, that the spiritual power that the priests and chiefs who lived at this site would have had if you control the portal to the afterworld? That is a very kind of powerful place to be. And so, a lot of this imagery and our increasing understanding of this imagery is giving us an eye, not only to sort of how ancient people in the South viewed their world, but also into how those beliefs may have articulated with mechanisms that maintain the power of some of the chiefs who clearly were very, very powerful at that time. So with that, let me end, and I am happy to take any questions that you all might have.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Vin. That was absolutely fascinating. What an interesting, maybe we could reduce your screen, stop sharing your screen.
Let me stop the share.
And I will pull up, we have some questions. We have questions till 10:25. I ate into a little bit of your time, so if we need to go a little bit longer, we can. And just remember, folks, if I don't get to all your questions, we can revisit them in the panel discussion. Katie, very early on, asked about how much of the mounds are human-made structure versus mounded soil. I guess I would just say, did they look for places that were already maybe elevated and then add to them?
There are a few cases of that, but for the most part, all of the mounds I showed you are artificially constructed from the ground up.
Okay, and in a similar vein, Katie Williams asks, Where did the soil come from? Are there signs of depressions or mines in specific areas? And how much did these mounds change the geography of the area?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. On Moundville and at Moundville, there are borrow pits that are now ponds that are not natural, but are places near the mounds where soil was borrowed to build the mounds. And the other thing that I didn't mention, but that the question really speaks to is, it's not just the construction that happened at these sites was not just the mounds. The mounds that stick up are the most obvious parts. But there was a tremendous amount of what I'll call terraforming that happened. These landscapes weren't perfectly flat, and an enormous amount of effort went into creating flat plazas by sort of leveling off heights and filling in depressions. Someone made an estimate at Cahokia, of how much earth moving went into just the flattening, the terraforming of the plaza, and it was enormous. So yes, it's not just the mounds. And of course, all the wooden structures. Moundville was surrounded by a fortification wall, a wooden palisade that consisted of logs this big around. Based on the length of the palisade and the spacing of the logs that we've seen archaeologically in the places where it's been exposed, it's estimated that it took 10,000 logs to surround that central part of Moundville. And that palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times. And these logs are being cut down, shaped, and moved without iron tools, which is, again, a very, very labor-intensive process.
Thank you for that. Mary Ellen, a 4th grade teacher. Thank you, Mary Ellen, for teaching our students out there, and certainly go to carolinak12.org for more resources. But Mary Ellen asked, this came a little bit earlier when you were talking about Serpent Mound. Was Serpent Mound built by these early farmers, or was it later?
So the Serpent, there's a mound, a well-known mound in Ohio called the Serpent Mound, and that predates that falls in a period that I did not talk about. That falls later than the archaic mounds, Poverty Point, but earlier than the Mississippian mounds.
So Ben, I'm going to combine that with this question here from Liz Moore. They can continue in this vein. Who asked, I lived in Circleville, Ohio years ago in 7th grade and learned about the mound builders in history class. Did these people communicate with those in the South? Was it the same time period? So again, it's kind of in the same vein.
Great question. And I that's a whole period that I skipped over because I just didn't want to run out of time. So let me just very briefly talk about the history of mound construction in Eastern North America. You've got these early mounds during what we call the Archaic period, from about 6,000 to 1,000 BC, and I talked about those. Starting at about 1,000 BC to about 400 or 500 AD, you have another burst of mound construction. A lot of that mound construction is in Ohio and Illinois in the Midwest, but there are also, you find contemporary mound sites in the South as well. And those are the periods that are called early woodland and middle woodland. The cultures, the best known cultures from that period are called Adena and Hopewell. And so Circleville was either an Adena or a Hopewell mound site. It's called Circleville because of the circular native earthwork that was built there. And those, that's that's kind of step 2 in the mound building tradition of the East. And step 3 are the kinds of mounds I talked about in my talk. So the mounds I talked about at the end are later than Circleville, but Circleville is later than Poverty Point. It falls in the middle.
Great, thank you for that, Vin. One of our board members, Paul Connick, is out there. Hello, Paul. Paul asks, regarding the social and political hierarchy, were all of these societies patriarchal? Were any ruled by women or egalitarian? And then if they were pantheists, did their pantheon mirror this social hierarchy? Did their cosmos do the same?
So it's an interesting question. All of these societies, let me talk about the Natchez, because this is a society that is documented not only archaeologically, but we have contemporary accounts from the European settlers who settled among them in the early 1700s. The Natchez, most native societies were matrilineal. So descent was reckoned through the female line. But among the Nazis anyway, you have the principal political offices, the Great Sun and the Tattooed Serpent, were filled by high-ranking males. So what that means is that if you are the Great Sun, your heir, the next great son in line, the next highest ranking person in the next generation, is your oldest sister's oldest son, because descent is reckoned through the matriline, not through the patriline. So in the Natchez case, the women, and there was also an office, it was that the French translated, they called, the gloss was white woman, who was the mother of the great son, or if she was gone, then his oldest sister. But the French mostly sort of talk about political power being vested in the males. Now, was that because they were not sort of attuned to the power that the women had? But you do find in Mississippian sites, you do find women and men in elaborate regalia. So I think there were some of both. That's, I guess, the short answer.
Great, thank you for that. Mary Ellen also asked if our fourth grade teacher, says more of a comment, and it sort of speaks to something you had said at the very head of your lecture about archaeology. We were not taught about the ancient culture which existed before the United States, but taught about the ancient Greeks and Romans, right, because then people of the US would have to admit that a great nation existed before the Europeans arrived here. You know, Vin, that reminds me, when I teach about colonialism, one of the markers the French had for civilization was organized religion, monumental architecture, and writing. And so you can just see what is the legacy of that, and can you speak a little bit more on this civilizational idea?
Right. Well, no, it's clear that, and I know people in Native communities that are still here, feel this way and understand that. I mean, the history is written by the people who are in power. It was certainly not in the interest of English colonists or French colonists to kind of talk about this. And I will say that in the East in particular, and we see this archaeologically, and we see it in the early historical record, there was actually a massive depopulation of Native people in the early decades of European colonization. The Spaniards go through the South in the 1540s. The De Soto expedition travels, starts in Florida, ends up going down the Mississippi Valley, having traveled across the South. De Soto's narratives describe large populated towns, describe the kinds of societies that I talked about archaeologically, with powerful chiefs that the Spaniards called caciques. So they saw what I described in that archaeological record. And of course, my description is made knowing that these Spanish accounts exist that corroborate those interpretations. By the time the French, then there's a gap of about a century or century and a half until about 1700 in the southeastern interior, and when the French and English are coming in. And between those two periods, there's been a major depopulation in the sort of center of the South. And it's probably because there were just, European diseases spread ahead of the Europeans themselves. And so that sort of contributed to this, maybe to this sense that some of these chieftains had already collapsed by the time the French and English got there.
Great. We have, we're running short on our time here for this session. Quickly, would you be willing to share any of these slides with Mary Ellen, fourth grade teacher?
I can do that. Let's communicate afterward.
We will help facilitate that. One thing, Mary Ellen, I just want to let you know, you really should also go to carolinak12.org. We have an extensive database of lesson plans, including much information on Native American culture throughout the span of that history. So go ahead,
and
please.
If I could just jump in, the research labs of archaeology that I'm part of on campus, we launched a sort of portal of all things concerning North Carolina archaeology. It's called Ancient North Carolinians, and the website is ancientnc.org. www.web.unc.edu. And you will find lesson plans and all sorts of resources there about North Carolina's ancient past.
Great. And Paul Bonici is putting in links to all of this in the chat there for everybody. We are going to have to take a break. I see Lloyd Kramer has an excellent question. I guess, could you give a short answer? Were there conflicts or wars between the peoples in these different communities?
Yes. I mean, archaeologically, you can see evidence of conflict. That as you go through time, there are periods where conflict increases and other periods where conflict decreases. But the conflict, I mean, the fact that these sites are often fortified is evidence of that. And you also find evidence of injury due to violence in people who are buried in ancient times. And so, yes, but it's not this constant state of war. It's just like any other part of the world. There are times when there's a lot of conflict and times when there is less.
Competition for resources or other reasons, it happens. So
yeah, it's geopolitics. It just
the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's true.
All right. Well, our last question isn't a question at all. It's from Byron Braswell, just saying excellent presentation, very educational and informative, and we agree 100%. My friends, please thank one more time. Can you hear the applause in the ether, Vin?
In my mind's ear, I can hear it.
Well, thank you so much, folks. We will return at 10:45 for the second session. Get some coffee, take a break. One more time, thank you, Vincent Stepanidis. It's been absolutely very informative and wonderful imagery as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, take a little break. We'll see you at 10:45.